The 250,000 hit me before the word orphan did. 250,000 children. Moved like a solution. And if that number feels abstract, imagine a whole city's worth of kids, picked up, renamed, redistributed, until childhood itself starts to feel like a shipping label peeling off in the rain. Source. I found this while researching something else entirely. A stray line in a transcript. A woman in Texas. 14 months old on the ride. And an update, tacked onto a 2019 episode like an afterthought, that said she'd died at 100, after living her whole life in one town, East Bernard. A life so long it reached back into the last breaths of an American experiment. Source. The official story goes like this. America had a crisis of abandoned and homeless children in the mid-1800s. Cities like New York were overflowing. Charities stepped in. A minister named Charles Loring Brace helped build a system, through the Children's Aid Society, to send children west to farm families and small towns, where, in theory, they'd get food, school, church, and a chance. Source. And let me be fair to the official narrative. Some children did find love. Some were protected. Some became governors, teachers, soldiers, parents who swore they would never let a child feel disposable again. Even critics admit the movement helped shape modern foster care by insisting, at least on paper, that kids belonged in homes, not warehouses. Source. But here's what matters. The timeline isn't subtle. 1854 to 1929. 75 years of departures and arrivals, so many that even the institutions that ran it can't agree on the total, because the records were never unified, and some were lost or destroyed. That's not a footnote. That's the story trying to erase itself. Source. I kept thinking about the word estimate. Estimated 250,000. Estimated because paperwork failed. Estimated because some names vanished. Estimated because, in the places where the truth should be sitting, in a filing cabinet, in a ledger, in a case file, there are gaps. Not always sinister gaps. Sometimes just neglect. Sometimes fire, flood, boredom, moving day. But gaps all the same. Source. Speaking of filing cabinets, there's a detail that changes the temperature of the room. On PBS's American Experience, the story includes a tiny elderly woman, Ethel Lambert, working in the basement of the Children's Aid Society headquarters long after the movement's peak. She hated having her photograph taken. But she loved the papers. She hunted for them. And by studying the building's architecture, she found a hidden closet behind old filing cabinets, diaries, scrapbooks, letters from children organized year by year. Buried in plain sight. Source. If you want a single artifact to hold in your mind, make it that closet. A wall. A seam. A false back. And a stack of voices that nearly became rubbish. Because the part that keeps me up at night isn't that children were sent away. It's how close we came to never hearing them say what it felt like. Source. Now, the official story will also tell you the Orphan Train wasn't one train. There were thousands. Writers often believe theirs was the only one, because childhood is small and the world is huge. Only later, at reunions, did many realize they were part of something much larger, something that had been happening at the same time in other towns, other depots, other church basements, other stages. Source. And yes, stages. That's not metaphor. In many towns, children were displayed so prospective families could look them over: height, teeth, arms, strength. The official rationale was practicality. Homes were needed quickly, communities had to meet the children, committees would screen families, placements were trial-based. But even neutral descriptions start to sound like a marketplace when you read them closely. Source. So let's start with the numbers. 10,000 children on New York streets, sometimes more, at a time when the entire city had fewer than 600,000 people. Arrested for vagrancy. Locked up with adults. It's easy to forget how thin the boundary was between child and criminal when poverty did the naming. Source. Which brings me to the first date chain I couldn't stop rereading. May 19, 1854, Brace writes in his diary about finding a barefoot 9-year-old begging on 6th Street. That same year, he's walking into coffee cellars where boys, not more than 10 or 12 years old, smoke and gamble like exhausted adults. A few months later, late September 1854, 45 children arrive in Dowagiac, Michigan. The timing is almost theatrical: observation, obsession, action. Source. The official story goes like this: it worked. Those first children were placed within a week. The children sang hymns. The town softened. The experiment looked like salvation. And once the system worked once, it became repeatable. Repeatable turns into scalable. Scalable turns into routine. Routine turns into a machine that doesn't always pause to ask what it's cutting. Source. Speaking of machines, there's another institutional detail that changes the shape of the story. The Children's Aid Society's records, nearly 800 linear feet, more than 1,000 boxes, exist, but much of the most personal material is restricted. Researchers are interviewed. Permission is required. And even when permission is granted, guidelines can prohibit publishing names of children and families. That's not a conspiracy. It's privacy law, ethics, liability. But the effect is the same: the center of the story becomes hard to quote. Source. So what happens when the most human parts of history are sealed, restricted, off-site, while the polished summaries remain public? What patterns does that create? What myths rush in to fill the silence? And who benefits when the only easy-to-repeat version is the one that sounds tidy? Source. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But every time I read restricted, I also read unspoken. And every time I read estimate, I also read missing. The Orphan Train movement may have been a welfare experiment, but it also produced a second experiment: what happens to a person when their origin story is treated as paperwork? Source. The official narrative also emphasizes compassion. Brace believed orphanages were gloomy and that farm homes were better. He imagined kind Christian homes. He wanted to get children utterly out of their surroundings. You can hear the moral urgency in that language. You can also hear something else: the idea that environment can be amputated like a diseased limb. Source. But here's the anomaly that repeats. The movement wasn't only for orphans. Many children weren't orphans at all. Some had living parents who signed surrender papers out of desperation. Some were taken because a parent drank, or died, or disappeared into illness. "I'm not an orphan," one writer said. "My mother's still living." "You're going to Texas." No use arguing. That's not rescue. That's relocation with grief still breathing. Source. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The movement promised new homes, but the price was often new identities. Names changed. Birth dates shifted. Children learned quickly that their past was something to keep quiet, because communities talked about bad blood, about inherited vice, about immigrant stains that couldn't be washed out by a new dress. Source. There's a line in the obituary's transcript, delivered like a thesis statement by a teenager performing history, that sounds almost too clean to be real: "Your life begins when you are chosen." It's a beautiful sentence. It's also a knife, because it suggests the life before choosing doesn't count. And the system, in practice, often behaved as if that were true. Source. Which brings me to Beatrice. 14 months old. A baby on a train. In the Mobituaries episode, she's interviewed at an assisted living facility in East Bernard, Texas, surrounded by relatives, while the narrator calls her a national treasure. And then, later, there's the update: she passed away at 100, after living her whole life in East Bernard. No dramatic verdict. No cinematic confession. Just the quiet stubbornness of survival. Source: if the title of this documentary sounds certain, died in 2019, that's part of the problem I'm trying to name. The episode first aired in December 2019. The update about her death is, since then. But the calendar date isn't the point. The pattern is. A century-long life reduced to a postscript, stapled onto an episode description like a shipping confirmation, delivered. Source: so what did she reveal? Not secrets. Not scandal. Something colder. Something more human. When asked about her birth mother, about the life she might have had, Beatrice doesn't romanticize the past. She shrugs at the hypotheticals. She's grateful for Texas. She's satisfied. And there's a moment where the lack of longing feels like its own kind of scar tissue, the body sealing itself so it can keep living. Source: that's not a happy ending. That's an adaptation. And adaptations can look like gratitude, even when the original wound never got the dignity of being spoken aloud. Now let's widen the lens, because Beatrice is one dot at the end of a long line. On May 31, 1929, the Children's Aid Society sent 3 boys to Sulphur Springs, Texas, described as the last orphan train. You can almost hear the brakes squeal in the date itself, 1929, the year the country's optimism shattered into depression. The timing is almost theatrical. Source: but the ending is messy. Because another major institution, the New York Foundling Hospital, also placed children, often younger infants, sometimes matched by hair and eye color to reduce stigma. That's an official strategy, offered without shame. If a child can pass as biologically related, the town might be quieter, the bullying softer, the gossip less lethal. That's not rescue. That's camouflage. Source: and camouflage leaves its own trace in the archives. Because when a system is built to make origins disappear, genealogists spend generations trying to reverse engineer what was deliberately blurred. Speaking of blur, there's a statistic that should be simple but isn't. Was it 200,000 children? 250,000? More? One major public history summary says, approximately 200,000. The National Orphan Train Complex explains why 250,000 is an estimate, and why records were lost or destroyed. Different numbers. Same underlying problem, the count was never the priority. The movement's moral logic was. Source: that's not math. That's philosophy. If a society can't count the children it relocates, what else can't it count? Grief? Sibling separation? The years lost to silence? Because siblings are the recurring ache. Even when agencies tried to keep them together, separation happened, by gender in institutions, by age, by convenience, by a farmer wanting a strong boy but not his little brother, by a town that took the older kids and rejected the younger ones as too small to work. Writers spoke about brothers screaming for brothers as they were carried away. That is the sound that echoes through every official statistic. Source: now, Act 3 is where the story changes for me, because this is where the anomalies stack. The official narrative says supervision existed. Agents would visit. Children could be moved if conditions were bad. Letters were written. Reports filed. And yet even sympathetic sources admit the extent of abuse is unknown, and that monitoring thousands of placements with a handful of agents was structurally impossible. That's not an accusation. That's arithmetic. Source: let's start with the documents. The Minnesota Historical Society's primary source guide lists Children's Aid Society annual reports, braces the dangerous classes of New York, and Hastings Hart's Placing Out Children in the West, the paper trail of a movement explaining itself in real time. Those titles alone tell you what the system believed, that the problem was dangerous classes, that the solution was placing out, that the children were both victims and potential threats. Source. And in the New York Historical Society's collections, there are broadsides, public notices, posted in towns to announce children arriving, calling them orphans, even when they were not. The broadside is the movement's public mask: clean type, clean purpose, clean story. But behind it are the surrender papers, the lost envelopes, the letters hidden on shelves by foster parents who didn't want an agent asking questions. Source. Speaking of hidden letters, there's a pattern that repeats across accounts: adults managing information. A caretaker tells a boy, "Where you're going, you won't need that envelope." A mother hides a letter from the Children's Aid Society for years. A town is told not to mention adoption. The system doesn't just move bodies. It moves knowledge. Source. And once knowledge is movable, it becomes tradable. Who gets to know the truth first? Who gets to decide when a child is old enough to hear it? Who benefits when a person's origin story is treated as unstable property? Which brings me to a writer's story that reads like a manifesto. Alice Bullis Ayler, described by the National Orphan Train complex as among the last 3 children to ride, remembered being separated from siblings, the boys crying, "Don't go away," and later being moved family to family as unpaid labor, told she had bad blood. She looked at her veins, trying to see what others claimed was inside her. That's not just cruelty. That's a theory of heredity being used as a weapon. Source. And that's where the pattern gets bigger than one movement. Because bad blood isn't unique to the orphan trains. It appears wherever poverty is treated as biological destiny. Where immigrant families are treated as defective stock. Where children are seen as salvageable only if you cut them off from their roots. Maybe the orphan train was a genuine rescue effort that saved lives. Maybe it was also a labor pipeline dressed as charity. Maybe it was the best idea available in a brutal era. But the pattern indicates something else too: a nation practicing, at scale, the separation of children from origin as a management strategy. Source. And to be clear, the orphan train is not the only American example of that strategy. The New York Historical Society's discussion of family separation points to other systems: forced repatriation, Native American child removal, slavery, different eras, different mechanisms, same underlying question: when does a society decide families are optional, and children are movable? The orphan trains sit inside that longer moral argument like a needle you can still feel under the skin. Source. Now let's talk about what people get wrong, because fairness matters. Not every placement was abusive. Not every farm family wanted labor. Some writers describe kindness so intense it feels like a second birth: ponies, bicycles, never being hit, being shown off in photographs because a parent was proud. Other writers describe coldness, loneliness, being used as a maid. The truth isn't one story. It's a distribution. Source. But here's what matters again. Even the good outcomes often required forgetting. Or at least not asking. Or at least accepting that the past was a closed door. So when I return to Beatrice, I hear her satisfaction differently. Not as proof the system worked. Not as proof it failed. As proof that humans can survive almost any origin story if they're given a place to land, and that survival sometimes looks like refusing to stare too long at what was taken. Source. And that brings me to the last act, the lingering questions. Where are the remaining records right now? Some are at the National Orphan Train complex. Some are in institutional archives like the New York Historical Society, stored off-site, partially restricted, supervised, permission-based. Some are in attics, suitcases, Bibles, handbills, photographs of companies, of children posed like proof of a mission. Some are simply gone, lost or destroyed, turning family history into rumor that descendants chase for decades. Source. What does it mean that a movement this large can still feel hidden? That 250,000 children can vanish into local stories without becoming national memory? Is that because the movement was shameful? Or because children are always the easiest witnesses to ignore? Source. And what do we do with the documents that exist, but can't be freely named? The finding aid says researchers may need special permission, and publications may be asked to exclude names of children and families. Again, ethics. Privacy. But also a strange historical irony, because the movement itself often stripped children of names, and now the archive protects the same names from being spoken. Protection can look like silence from certain angles. Source. So here's my last question, the one that keeps looping back like a train whistle at night. If your life begins when you are chosen, what happens to the part of you that began before that? Does it dissolve? Does it wait in a hidden closet behind filing cabinets? Does it survive in a town like East Bernard, Texas, inside a woman who lived 100 years and still treated the question like an inconvenience? Source. I don't have answers, only patterns. 250,000 children moved on rails. A paper trail that's partly restricted, partly missing. A public narrative that prefers neat numbers. And a final writer, interviewed as a living artifact, who revealed something haunting precisely by not revealing much at all, that history doesn't always end with confession. Sometimes it ends with a person who learned, very early, that survival means closing the door softly and calling it home. Source. If you want visual anchors while you read or record this, the National Orphan Train complex building and exhibits are a modern doorway into the archive. Image, National Orphan Train complex and image, museum exhibits can help ground the narrative in a place that still exists. Source. And if you want the closest thing to a haunted object in this entire story, it might be that hidden closet archive described in American Experience, diaries and letters saved because one person refused to treat them like rubbish. Because once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Source.